And we are live. Welcome, mystery and thriller fans. I'm your on-air host, Sara DiVello. And for the first time ever in 3+ years and 350 interviews, I'm doing something I've never done before. I am bringing a guest host on to interrogate me. So mystery and thriller loving friends and fans and fam, please welcome back to the show, New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, Pulitzer Prize Jurist, and New York Times Book Reviewer for 5 years, the incredible, the one and only Danielle Trussoni, aka Truth Serum Trussoni, here to give me the good grilling. Danielle, welcome.
Hi. Oh my goodness, I'm so happy to be here, and I'm happy to be the brutal purveyor of truth serum for you after 3.5 years of you giving other people the run, the hot seat. But before we begin, I just want to say to everybody that's here, I'm really envious of all of you because you haven't had a chance to read this book yet. I read this book when I was on my book tour, and I just devoured it. It's a delicious, addictive book, and I want everybody to go out and pre-order a copy if you haven't already, or plan to go tomorrow to buy it in your bookstore. And I promise that you're going to enjoy it. So Sara, can I just dive right in, or do you have anything that you want to say?
Dive right in, my friend. Dive right in, my friendly, brutal interrogator.
I'm going to be brutal. So the first thing I want to say about this book is that it's a historical mystery based on a true crime. That fascinated me from the beginning, the concept. And first of all, it fascinated me just because I love the 1920s. I think it's my favorite period, and especially in New York, but also because I had a personal connection to this story that I would love to share with everyone. And my great grandmother, Sara and I discovered when we were talking about this, my great grandmother, I think I have a photograph of her somewhere here, was in New York City in 1922, 1923, and she would have known the characters in this because she was a Ziegfeld Follies girl. So Sara and I were comparing notes, and it was like, oh my God, that's amazing that this could have possibly happened.
How freaking crazy is that? So Danielle, messaged me, and she was like, wait, my grandmother was there. And in the book, in Broadway Butterfly, the murder victim, Dot King's roommate, Hilda Ferguson, who moved out 2 weeks before the murder, otherwise it might have been a double homicide, was in the Ziegfeld Follies. And then Danielle tells me that her great-grandmother was in the Ziegfeld Follies. And I was like, oh my God, your great-grandmother knew these girls. Absolutely knew Dot King's roommate, was in the Ziegfeld Follies, and probably knew Dot King because it was a small little showgirl circle and everybody kind of knew everyone. So how crazy is that?
It's totally crazy. It's this like little connection that makes this book feel super personal. Although I think that anyone reading it will really fall into the characters and the world of this book because it's so richly drawn, which brings me to my first question for you. It's a true crime mystery. You had a whole bunch of challenges, I'm sure, with all of the material that you had to sort through, all of the decisions narratively you had to make, because when you're reading this, just for everybody out there who hasn't read it, which is most of you, it moves very quickly, and it moves in and out of different characters' points of view, but it never feels like there's extraneous information. So how did you decide what to include, and what perspectives were the important ones?
So that is such a great question, Danielle, because, I'm a bit of a pack rat. I'm a bit of a hoarder. I'm a saver. I like to keep everything. And so that was actually a really hard thing for me. And so at one point, because also everything's fascinating to me. So I'm like, oh, cars had just been invented. I've got to put that in. Oh, daycare cost 5 cents a day. Well, I've got to put that in. Everything was just so interesting. And at one point I was like, okay, when the book was 180,000 words, which was 2 books crammed into one, I said, okay, I got to tighten this baby up. And so I wrote it on a Post-it note. my job is to separate out that which is integral from that which is merely interesting. And that became my mantra, and my intention for this book was taking out the things which I thought were fascinating, but which were not integral to the crime and the investigation and the telling of the story. And it was hard because I love these people, having spent 9 years with them, and everything was fascinating to me.
And so Dot King, she's the victim, and she sort of creates this centrifugal force in the book, like an organizing force, I think of her as, although we never really meet her. You know, she's just this absence, and there's so much about her. We meet her family, we meet her roommate, we meet her lovers. So how did you discover her? Like, what was the thing that happened that brought her to you?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. So, Danielle, I am a fact-based, research-based person. And I'm also a bit of a mystic. And I think you can relate to that as well. So I believe that every story finds its teller, and every teller finds their story. And that it is a meeting and mingling of energy, the way that you meet anyone, whether it's a lover or a friend, or, just someone who's meant to be in your life. You meet people for a reason, I believe. And so I think that I feel drawn to the story. I love these people, and I feel in some way that they chose me to tell their story. And so that's just the baseline of how I want to frame the story. But the way that I found this particular story, or maybe she found me, was because I was home in Philadelphia for Thanksgiving 10 years ago, Thanksgiving 2013. And, the day after Thanksgiving, we're sitting around and we're having Thanksgiving, we're having leftovers, and, because we're not out hitting the Black Friday sales, because we're not insane. And conversations turn to reminiscing. So we're eating our leftovers, and my aunts and uncles and cousins are talking. And my Uncle Ed, who was up from DC, starts to talk about how back in the 60s, he and my Uncle David, after high school let out, they would sneak over to the old castle and they would sneak cigarettes and drink beers, which feels very 1960s. Like, I kind of wish I was born then. And while I'm listening to this, I was like, oh, that's so fun. Haha. Wait a minute, what castle? Because my aunt lives in a very normal, suburban development where everything is a split level ranch circa 1950. There's no freaking castles in sight. So I'm looking around for the alleged castle. And then like I could miss a castle, and my Uncle Ed says, no, like over there in the next development, there used to be a great estate. Well, needless to say, I was, putting my leftover turkey sandwich aside to go, listen into the castle discovery. And he said, let's go over. So all 11 of us pile into the cars. We caravan over, and there, in the middle of the next suburban development with the split level ranches, between the Subarus and the tulip beds, are indeed the ruins of a great estate. So it felt like standing in the middle of Rome or Athens. There was headless statues of Diana, of Zeus, a pool, the remnants of the edges of a pool where a fountain had once gurgled, stairs going to nowhere, 50-foot pillars stretching up to the sky, but no roof. And it was so befuddling. It was so cognitively dissonant to see the Subaru, the tricycle, the spring has sprung garden flag. And then this, it just was so bizarre. So I dove down the research hole. I had to learn more, and I learned everything there was to know about this estate. So there was 147 rooms. There were 28 bathrooms, 24 fireplaces, its own movie theater, its own radio station, its own gymnasium, a ballroom. President Harding was the first notable guest, and then they had a housewarming party and invited 1,000 of their nearest and dearest friends. It just was so insane to think of people living like that. And so I thought, well, that was really fascinating, but I'm just not in the castle writing business. Like not my jam, although I love that. So I put it aside, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it was like a tingling, like an awareness. I just couldn't let it go. And so finally, a couple months later, I went back to it and I found a book published in the 1950s that had one paragraph, one reference of a sentence that said, that this castle, this great estate was tangentially related to a murder. And that was it. I knew I had to tell that story.
Oh my God. And so from there you found did you find Dot King first, or did you find Frances first? Because I just want to say one of my favorite scenes, and there are many favorite scenes in this book, is a moment about a third of the way into the book when Frances learns the truth about what's happening. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's just this devastating scene where I paused, I put my book down, I took a deep breath, and I was like, oh my God, can you imagine if you found out that your husband was involved in something like this, right?
Yeah. So I found Frances first. And so Frances is the daughter of this family that lives in the castle. She's the princess. So I was fascinated by her life because this is a time when women didn't have a lot of power in society. So women didn't have their own passports. If you were married, your passport said your husband's name and then just and wife. So when another character in the book, Dot King's roommate, who was friends with your great grandmother, when she decides to go to Paris later in the book, she has to apply for a passport because she's not married. And the hoops that they make her jump through in order to get a passport, because they don't want women traveling, are insane. She has to get a letter from her father that says, I am her father and I am allowing her to have a passport. I'm allowing her to leave the country. And because her father was dead, she had to get a passport from her mother saying, my husband is dead. He can't give permission. Therefore, I have to give permission and it's okay with me. I mean, that's the level of control of women totally that we're talking about.
Really insane.
It's insane. So this is just the time that we're talking about. So in this time when women are kept at home and have very little power, Frances actually has a lot of power. So she is named one of the 4 most powerful women in society, which is the celebrity-like level of wealth that existed as celebrities before celebrity culture, before we had celebrity culture, because movies had just been invented and we didn't have movie stars. She's named one of the foremost 3 weeks before this murder. She's named one of the foremost powerful women in society whose glance or one word could, quote, stop a social climber in her tracks. So here's this woman who, in this world that doesn't want her to have any power, has the most power that she can have. And other than that, she's pretty much hosting parties. She's supporting her husband's career. She's supervising the governesses that raise her children, right? She's living this very, very wealthy, privileged, but also very specific life. And so that was the character that I first met. And I was fascinated by her and fascinated by the devastating revelation that we learn about her, a third of the way into the book.
So the way that we get into this and the way that we move into what happens is through a character named Julia Hartman. And Julia is a fascinating character. She is in some ways the exact opposite of Frances. She is a working woman. She's a newspaper lady.
Yes.
I think at one point she calls herself a newspaper man or something in the book.
Yes, that's what they call themselves.
And she has found a way to have kind of it all in some ways. She's married to someone she loves. She has a career she loves. She's ambitious. She's a vibrant, amazing character. And it's through her investigation that we are actually taken through this story.
Yes.
And the structure of the book works so well because you have this investigative element. So did you find articles? So this is based, she's a real character, like all of the characters in this book. Did you find her writing, and how did you adapt that for the book?
So I researched this book for 9 years, researched and wrote it for 9 years. In that, over the course of that time, I amassed over 1,700 pieces of research. So that are Julia's articles. So Julia is our lead character. She is the rare female reporter in a time when, again, women don't have a lot of power. Or less than 20% of women worked outside of the home in America. Now that number is 40%. 40% of American women work outside the home. And the 20% then that did work outside the home primarily worked in factories as shop assistants, sales clerks, or, as telephone operators or something like that. So very few women worked in newspapers. And the very few women that did primarily covered what's called the society pages. So we're talking the fashion, the food, the trips, the parties that the celebrities of the time, which were this wealthy echelon known as society, were setting the trends of. Now, most women reporters are covering that, or they're covering the cooking column or the astrology column or life advice for the lovelorn. And often it's one woman who's doing all of that. Julia, however, is on the city desk. She's covering hard-hitting crime. And she's the rare woman who's doing that. So I got to accumulate all of her articles, or as many as I could possibly find. Every single article that she wrote, I think I found it. I also found all the articles that the men at the other newspapers were writing. I found memoirs by the head of the homicide, the NYPD homicide division. He wrote a memoir about his time creating the homicide unit and the investigations that he undertook. And I found the memoir of the secretary to the New York Police Commissioner. So I had a lot of voices and a lot of perspectives on this crime. Now, I researched those. I read them all. Then I dictated them into my computer so that I could really get the rhythm and the word choice of these people embedded in my brain. And also all be able to use as many of those pull quotes as I could. And then for the dialogue that I simply couldn't get, like interrogation scenes by the police of various suspects, like the meetings of Julia and her editor, like Julia and her conversation between Julia and her husband, who's also a reporter. I wasn't getting those because they happened secretly behind closed doors. And so I was able to recreate them or imagine what they would be because I had memorized and ingrained in myself their words and their rhythms and the way that they spoke. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And actually, that reminds me of something I wanted to ask you about Ella Bradford. Was she a character that you found material about, or was she a character? First of all, tell us about her a little bit because she's such a great character and I loved her. But is she a character that you found information that was printed, or was that something that you had to imagine?
So Ella is one of our four lead characters. So I tell this story through four main points of view. So we have Julia Hartman, the lead reporter who covered the case. We have Inspector John Coughlin, who's the head of the NYPD Detectives Unit. He's the lead investigating the case. We have Ella Bradford, who was the murder victim's closest friend, confidant, and the keeper of all her secrets. She is the one who finds the body in chapter 1 and realizes her friend, her confidant, and her employer is dead, has been murdered. And then the fourth is Frances Stotesbury. And she is in Palm Beach focusing on the election because it's a presidential election and they're about to host the presidential incumbent. So these are the four characters. Now, it was hard to find information about women during this time because, again, if you don't have much power in the world, if you don't have your own passport, your driver's license, if you're not out in the world as yourself with your own name, if you're just known as the wife of Mr. John, whoever, or, Mr. Westbrook Pregler, or whoever, and wife. If you're just and wife, it's going to be hard for me, Sara DiVello, 100 years later, to find out information about you. However, it was extra hard to find information about Ella because Ella was also Black. So as a Black woman, she was facing, sort of the exclusivity of whatever information would have been available as women, and then was doubly hard to find because there were less records for Black women. So I was looking for birth records, death records, marriage certificates, photos, diaries, journals, papers, anything I could find about Ella. It took me 6 years, but I found a picture of Ella Bradford,
Really?
and it was a great, great day of my life.
Oh yeah, actually it's on your website. And everyone here, if this interests you, you should go to her website because she has an amazing behind the books section that has all of her, not all of it, because it sounds like you had, a huge amount of research, but a lot of the research, photographs of all of these characters. It's a fascinating element of this book. So I'm wondering if you've had any difficulty when writing this, trying to shape the way that it would end, because I don't want to give too much away, but there's a lot that's not tied up in reality. And in the book, it's so seamlessly done. It's very beautifully done. And I really admired the ending. But I wondered as I was reading it as a fellow author, how did she make these decisions to do this?
Yes. So that was a really tough decision. So when I first started out 9 years ago, I was like, stand back, everyone. Detective DiVello is reporting for duty. Like, I'm going to solve this. I'm sorry it's remained unsolved for 90 years, but at last I'm here. Lasai, everyone, sit down and it's Miller time for you, but I'm reporting for duty. And I really thought, despite the fact that I have no detective experience, no forensics experience, I've never written a mystery before. I mean, I don't know who the hell I thought I was. Only the naive, the willfully, stupidly, ignorantly naive could possibly think this. But I was like, I've got this. So very quickly, and I spent 9 months researching, and then I started writing, and I was like, oh, wow, this is a complicated case, and B, the fact that it's 100 years old makes it really tough. So I interviewed police officers, professors of forensics, detectives. I interviewed so many people. I even hired a psychic that works with law enforcement on cold cases to help me figure this out because I felt so stuck. I was like,
What did she say? What did she say to you?
So Danielle, it was crazy. So first of all, I was very suspicious because I just had never, I'm not the kind of girl who usually goes to psychics. It's not like I'm like, oh, it's Psychic Tuesday, time to head over to the Crystal Ball Palace. And it's totally okay if anyone is. I sounded really judgmental there and I didn't mean to. I just am not usually a psychic visitor. But I thought, okay, I really need a clue here because Detective DiVello had run into the dead ends. And so I thought, let me hire, I had, heard about the, Long Island medium and all these different people, who work with law enforcement. And I was teaching at a yoga conference and a woman came up to me and bought a copy of my first book. And she said, what are you writing? And I said, I'm writing this mystery. And I said, I'm really feeling stuck. And she said, oh, I'm a psychic. I work with law enforcement. And I thought, okay, it's a sign. I'll hire her. So I did hire her. And I said, how does this work? And she said, okay, I want you to write a letter to the victim, to Dot King, and then ask her all the questions you want to know and anyone else in the case you want to talk to. And so I said, okay, great. And I sat down and she said, don't show it to me. So I sat down with my pen and paper and I was like, dear Dot, who killed you? And I was like, oh my God. Oh, how rude. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. You don't just walk up to someone and, without even introducing yourself, ask who killed them. It's just, socially unacceptable. So I thought, okay, let me, so then I thought, I don't know her well enough to call her Dot. So I said, dear Miss King, my name is Sara DiVello and I would like to write a book about who killed you. Would you mind telling me who killed you? I mean, Danielle, I spent an embarrassing amount of time writing a letter to a dead woman. And hours trying to figure and ripping him up. That's embarrassing. That's stupid. That's too businesslike. That's too familiar. I finally got the tone right. And I wrote the letter and I asked her the questions, introduced myself. I tried to be polite, professional, whatever. And then finally, whoa, butterfly down. I finally, I tried to get the tone kind of right. And I asked all the questions. And at the end of the session, you could have, knocked me over with a feather when all of those questions had been answered. So Dot King did not give me the name of the person who killed her, but she gave me the initial of the first name. And she said, I want you to investigate this person more. And so I said to the psychic, there's nothing more to investigate there. And she said, well, that's what she wants. And so I said, okay. So I was frustrated. I was annoyed, but I went back. I took a day to pout, to sulk angrily. And then I went back and I found actually my sister Hannah, because I was stomping around my apartment, complaining about it. And she said, let me just help you. And she starts, Googling, and I'm Googling. And then she finds on WorldCat, which is the world catalog of the holdings of every single library in the world. And it tells you what library has what, that the University of Pennsylvania Kislak Research Center, which is where the rare books are kept, had one copy left of only 2 in the entire world of the memoir of the secretary to the police commissioner, and that person's name that he wrote a book about began with this initial. And so I said to my husband, not only I've got to drive to Philadelphia, I have to go to the rare books collection. And he said, well, maybe you should call first. And I called and they said, we don't have that here. And I said, WorldCat says you do. And the guy said, I've worked here for 30 years. I don't think we do, but let me check. He called me back an hour later and said, I am shocked. We have this here. And he said, we didn't know it, so it hasn't been preserved right. So the paper is starting to disintegrate. So now we have to get an antique paper person in here to see if it's safe to touch the paper and if you can photograph it with the flash off, or if it's strong enough to be photocopied. I mean, it was a whole ordeal because it was secretly hanging out there. But when I was able to eventually get a photocopied flash off copy of this book, this tell-all book with only 2 copies left in the world, it gave me some really valuable research.
Oh my goodness. Wow. What a story. I feel like you need to write like a book about writing the book.
Oh my God. My research took me to some fascinating and far-flung places, to some really shocking places.
And so what's next? Do you mind talking about that? Or is that something that's a secret? But since I am Truth Serum Trussoni, I have to ask.
Truth Serum Trussoni is gonna, hog tie me to this chair and make me sing like a canary. So, Danielle, I feel like there is so much pressure in our culture to be faster, fast food, fast fashion, faster internet, faster phones, and especially in our industry to put out a book a year. So I think, but as an urban gardener, right, like I have a little tiny porch and I plant my seeds in the spring and then I water them and I feed them. And then in the summer, I harvest their veggies and fruit. And then I put the beds to sleep for the winter. They hibernate for the winter. And then I wake them up in the spring and I plant again. As an urban gardener, I know that everything in nature needs to rest. Everything needs to hibernate. And even our computers need to power down. And so I am taking this time for sacred rest. So I am launching my butterfly out into the world. I'm giving her wings as she emerges from her chrysalis. And then I'm going to hibernate and I'm going to rest myself and rest my creativity and let my sacred creative energy regenerate in its own time before I start to think about the next book. And that feels really hard because there is so much pressure to have a good answer and to already be working on the next book or have a draft and, have a book out a year, but I can't do it. That's just
there will be another book, right? Like
yes.
Maybe when, not next year, maybe not the year after, but when it's time.
Yes. And hopefully it won't take me 9 years this time.
I'm excited to read it. I'm selfishly asking.
Yay. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. So I think we might have some questions and maybe we should start to pop some of those up. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you, Murder by the Book. So if anyone has any questions, just go ahead and type them in the comment box and our trusty producer will get those going and get this going up on the screen. And if you need a moment to think of questions, I always think of my questions 3 days later at 3 a.m.
Oh my God, me too. I know I'm going to have a ton. I mean, I have questions about your writing process too, but I feel like I've just asked you so many questions. I think maybe if there's somebody out there who wants to ask one first, we can do that.
Well, I think, okay. Oh, hi, Diane. Diane is joining us from YouTube. What was your most memorable part of researching Broadway Butterfly? Oh, that's such a good question. So I think working with the psychic was definitely very memorable because I was not expecting that. Another moment was I was looking for, as Danielle asked, I was looking for Ella Bradford I just wanted to see her. I wanted to see all of them. And it took me years to find those photos of these people. And that I wanted to find Ella's birth certificate, I wanted to find her death certificate, and I wanted to find her marriage certificate. And I have failed on 2 of those 3 fronts. I could not find her birth certificate. I couldn't even find an exact birth year, but I did find her marriage certificate. And the story of that is kind of crazy. I was in New York actually doing this advertising project about finding your path in life and finding the courage to do what you're called to do. And in New York, and 6th Avenue, a water main broke and they were jackhammering it up all night. Needless to say, I did not get much sleep. So I wanted to go get a white noise machine. And as I was walking to the Bed Bath & Beyond to get the white noise machine in hopes of getting my 40 winks the next night, I was walking down the street and I was thinking about Ella, and all of a sudden I heard wedding bells. And I always like to see a bride. I'm always like, oh, let me see a bride. So I was looking around for the bride, but I didn't see any brides or any, it was like, Midtown. It was the middle of the day. It was not Midtown. It was downtown, but it was the middle of the day. People were going to work in their suits. And I realized that there are no wedding bells. Like only I'm hearing them. So I pretend I'm not and just keep walking. But on the way back from getting the white noise machine, I was still thinking about it. And I paused where I heard them and there was an old building across the street. And so I walked over to the security guard and I said, what is this place? And she told me, and I said, do you happen to have old records here from the 1920s? And she said, no, but we used to, but we moved them across the street at the municipal records. So I walk over there and I go in and I sit down and I go through the microfilm of 1922 and I found Ella's marriage certificate.
Oh my God.
And there she was, and I have it. And I get to have it and hold it and keep it. So that was it. Oh, hi, Lecha. Hi. She says, Sarah, who has been your hardest character to write about and why? So, Lecha, that is such a great question. Thank you so much for asking. Every single one of these was hard for me. And I think part of that is my own self-consciousness because I'm not a New York Times bestselling author like this incredible woman next to me. I'm pointing the wrong way. I'm not, I don't have 7 books under my belt yet. I'm not a New York Times bestselling author yet. I am learning as I go. And so that's the baseline. Second of all, each of these 4 people was hard for different reasons. So it was hard for me to write Detective Coughlin because I am not a white Irish American, first generation American Irish male cop. I'm not the head of a detectives unit of 1,200 men reporting to me. I don't know what it's like to be to walk in a male body. I don't know what it's like to be a detective. And so I felt very nervous to write a man. I thought, can I get this right? Because I wanted to be careful not to just not stereotype and be like me, big, strong man, Hulk, mad, Hulk, smash. I wanted him to honor him by writing the many facets of him. And Danielle, you wrote a male character too, and you wrote a beautifully complex male character in Mike Brink, who I dearly love. But I found that hard. I found Julia hard because I don't know what it's like to be a reporter. I don't know what it's like to be a Jewish woman in 1923, to be a Southern woman. She's from Memphis, Tennessee. I don't know what it's like to be from Memphis, Tennessee and live in New York City and to be seen as other. What must that have been like for her? It was hard for me to write Ella because Ella is Black, and I have the privilege of walking through this world in the skin of a white woman. And so I have never had to hold the burden of being fearful for my life or for my safety only because of the color of my skin. And I wrestled a lot with, do I have the right to tell the story? And how can I ensure that I get it right? Because I want to honor her and I want to honor her experience. And I will never fully know what it's like to be in her experience. And so I spent 9 years on that, and I worked very closely with Dr. Bernadine Nash McClam, who has a PhD in political science and a master's in divinity and a master's of business administration from Harvard, and also a master's from Brandeis, and she in social work, and she is brilliant and she is learned and she is also Black. And I said, help me get this right. Let me be humble and help me to honor her and to understand what it is to be a Black woman in America. And I worked very closely with her. And then I hired Dr. Piper Hughley, who's a professor of English literature at Clark University in Atlanta. And I said, help me to get this even more right, like double check me, make sure I got it right. And she had some more changes. And then also my publisher hired a sensitivity reader, and that person had even more changes. So I really wanted to get it as right as I could. And then it also was hard for me to write Frances because, in a shocking twist that nobody may know, I don't live in a 147-room mansion. I am sorry. I don't have 70 full-time gardeners. I'm the freaking gardener. And so I was writing about people who were so different than me. All of them were so different than me. And the time was 100 years ago. So it was like, what the heck do I know? And so I just wanted to get that right. Oh, Renee, thank you. Oh my gosh. So Renee says, did you dedicate Broadway Butterfly to Uncle Ed? I should have. So Renee, funny story. So I actually haven't shared this before. So I wanted to dedicate Broadway Butterfly to my husband, Ellen Nunnally, who believes that the justice system, though flawed, is still the great equalizer among all men and women, among all people. And I wanted to dedicate it to my Aunt Joan, who told me it would take me 10 years ago. And I said, I was enraged. I was like, shut up, Aunt Joan, you don't know anything. And then of course my Aunt Joan was right, as she always is, because she's so brilliant and always knows everything. And I forgot to write the dedication. So Broadway Butterfly has no dedication. And I'm so mad at myself.
Oh no. I wonder if you can add it later. Maybe you can add it to the next edition.
Oh my God. Or I go in there and I write it by hand on each
exactly. And when you sign it, you just, and also, I'm going to do it. And also.
Oh, hi, Sharon. Hi, Sharon, joining us from Minnesota. Sharon, it's so lovely to see your name pop up. Are you going on a book tour? She wants to know, maybe Minnesota. So Sharon, I am doing a mini book tour. So I am launching the book in New York City tomorrow, Tuesday, August 1st. Then I am going to Philadelphia and I am launching it in a castle, in an actual castle from 1885 with 67 gargoyles and turrets. And it actually was built by the same architect that Francis's family's castle was built by, because there's only so many castle makers, I guess. And then I am going to the Hamptons Author Night, and then I'm coming back to New York. I'm doing an event for the Arts Center in Midtown, and then I'm going to Boston, and I'm launching it there on Tuesday, August 29th, and then I'm going to Nantucket, and I'm launching it there. So I'm doing this mini tour, but it's really on the East Coast. So I'm not making it to Minnesota yet, but maybe someday, because I've never been and I've always wanted to go. Oh, hi, Julie. So nice to see you. She says, what was the biggest surprise in your research? I think it was Julie, it was how hard the women were to find. I thought it would be hard, but then as someone with OCD, anxiety, and type A perfectionism, I was like, I am up to the task. I will find you or I will die trying. It's really hard to find some information. It took me a day and a half to find that daycare costs 5 cents a day. Like, it takes so long to find any little nugget. So I think that was really surprising. It was also surprising to me that in 100 years, I thought, everything's changed. It hasn't. I was like, we have internet, we have TV, we have movies, we have cars, we have airplanes. We have so much that they didn't have, or that they had only a little baby nascent bud of an idea of then. But I think what was shocking to me, so that was not surprising. What was surprising is that in 1923, a woman could not legally smoke a cigarette on the sidewalk. She could be arrested for that. To cut your hair was considered scandalous, audacious, a statement. What are you trying to prove? You shouldn't be cutting your hair. Why the hell does anyone care if a woman cuts her hair? And I think what's really fascinating is that here we are in 2023, 100 years later, and we are still trying to legislate women's bodies and what they do and how they look and what they do with their body. And it just is so insane to me that so much has changed, and yet nothing has changed.
Truth.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you for the great question, Julie.
So do we have time for more from me, or I don't know how much time we have?
Yes, we have 19 more minutes.
Okay. So sort of jumping off what Julie asked you, did you ever, so I know some people when they're writing a true crime novel, right? Like a novel that's based on a true crime, will take liberties, right? They'll make up elements to bridge the plot, to make this character work in this situation and to make this happen faster. Did you ever find yourself, one, wanting to take liberties, and two, did you actually ever do that?
That is such a great question, and thank you so much for asking. So there were times when I would think, man, this would be so much easier if it was fiction, because if I could control the narrative, I would choose to do this. Like, I would just have a bad guy jump out from behind a bush and attack Julia, or I would have, something scandalous happen here, or I would have this person who's kind of just a gray character be a real bad guy, or I'd have someone who's a good guy be a little more gray, or I would shape it differently. But the most important thing to me was to honor these people and the truth of their lives, because I was thinking, how would I feel if someone wrote a book about me now or in 100 years? And I think about all the embarrassing things I did and all the stupid things I did and all the shameful things that I feel stupid about saying or doing, and how I wished I had been better or whatever. And then I thought about how vulnerable each of us are. And I thought about how many books have been written about Princess Diana. I love the royals. I'm such a royal nerd. And I thought, how many people have told her story in such different ways, making her seem beleaguered or perfect or whatever. And how, if anyone ever told my story, I'd be like, hey, take care. Like, don't rush, get the whole me and tell it fairly. And so that was the most important thing to me, was to honor these people with all of the care and all of the concern that I would want anyone to take on my story or anyone else's story with. And so I never, ever wanted to err from the truth. I didn't care whether it wasn't that interesting or that perfect for the narrative arc. I only cared about honoring them and honoring the truth of their lives, the choices they made, the complexity of their humanity, and the fascinating cracks and crevices and facets of a whole person, And so I never took any liberties. However, what I learned is that you cannot, just like you can't get some dialogue, you can't get some scenes. So there are 2 scenes in the book that I had to fill in because I simply couldn't get it. They are both, one is the last chapter in May. I don't want to say what it is, but it takes place in a car. And the other one is a chapter in August. And I couldn't get it. I just couldn't get it.
So you could get the interrogation scenes? Like, you had information or insight into this, because I loved the where a lot of these characters were gathered together in an interrogation room, and we got to see what they said and how they said it. It was amazing. So did you actually have documents?
So what was interesting about the interrogation scene? I'm just going to say, I'm sorry. Those two scenes are in May. The 2 chapters in May is where Julia takes a trip, and Julia's in a car. Those are the two scenes that I had to fill in. And then, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say August. The interrogation scenes. What's really interesting is in 1923, there was not a separation. There was a smaller separation between reporters and police in a really shocking way that our modern day brains can't understand. So for instance, reporters had a press room in every police station.
Wow.
And reporters could sit in on interrogations.
Oh my God.
It would be unheard of now. Unheard of. And also, police would share very openly with reporters what they gleaned from interrogations with no sense of shame or no sense of, oh, is this misconduct? They were not thinking about that. So they both, because the reporters were allowed in the interrogation rooms sometimes, depending on the police officer and how good of a relationship he had with the reporter, and maybe he didn't like how the reporter portrayed him last week. So now that reporter's not allowed in the interrogation room, but the guy from the other newspaper gave the police a good perspective, so he is allowed in. I mean, it's like that kind of stuff. A lot of those interrogation scenes are drawn from actual pull quotes because they were allowed in. So it would say Gomeris was interrogated for, again last night for this many hours, and here's 3 things that happened. Now, they didn't have Gomeris's response, and so the police might say, I asked him this and he said that, but he wouldn't, maybe they didn't put his next reply. But you can imagine if someone's accused of murder and won't admit it, what their denial might be. So I might not have had the reply, but everything I got from direct pull quotes or
amazing
retelling.
That is amazing. I mean, it feels so authentic when you're reading it. And that's why I was like, as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, she's so good at making this feel exactly like we're in 1923. Another thing that I loved about this, and this is because I used to work, I don't know, you don't know about this, you don't know this little fact about me. I'm going to disclose some information. I used to work in a vintage clothing store in college, and I was the buyer. So I would go to auctions and buy old stuff. And I loved, my favorite period was the 1920s. Loved the clothes, loved the shoes. I loved all of it, right? And I have a collection even today of some sort of very beautiful pieces from the 1920s. So I'm just wondering about like your research into the clothing, because, you mentioned Guimaras, is that how you say his name?
Yes.
His fur coat, for example, he wears, it's sort of this iconic image of him, right? Like whenever you think of this character, you think of his long fur coat, and everybody else does too, right? Like he's in the newspaper with this coat. And, the clothes and like the gorgeous things that Dot King had, they're described, the jewelry and her, silk stockings and the various things that she has. Like, how did you get into that side of these characters?
Oh my gosh. So I spent so much time researching the fashions of the time, because what I realized is something that you write in passing. Julia zipped up her coat and ran out the door. I was like, oh crap, did they have zippers in 1923? And then I'm down the research rabbit hole trying to figure out if they have zippers. And then I'm like, whatever, I don't have time for this. She fastened her coat. Maybe it was a button, maybe it was a zipper, who cares? But there's only so many times where you can sort of, glass over it before it starts to feel not right and too glassy. So then I would have to go back and research whether they had zippers. They did, but they weren't used a lot. Or little things like that. But I looked at the advertisements for the shoes, for the clothes, for the hosiery, for the undergarments. They called underwear step-ins because you could just step in, unlike a corset where you had to be laced in. You can't really. They did have some self-lacing corsets where you could reach around and then pull yourself in. But really, that should be done. That's better done with a maid who can really, whittle your waist down to the point where you can't breathe. They had, everything from purses to hats. What I researched what hats were in season in spring 1923, what colors, what fabrics, what textures. And I saved all of that research because I also love the fashion and the shoes and the music and just the general fabulousness of it. But B, I just wanted it to feel really authentic. And I think also, early on I had gone to Boston College to talk to a professor who studies and researches how the police are portrayed in the media at the turn of the century in the 1920s, which is such a very specific, very, very specific thing to study, but worked out perfectly for me. So that was Professor Christopher Wilson at Boston College. And he said, oh, how are you researching? I said, I'm reading newspaper articles, biographies, memoirs, whatever. And then he said, you're not just reading the articles, are you? And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
Like I was embarrassed. I was like, of course not. I mean, and then I was like, I better confess it all to him. I was like, yeah, of course I'm just reading the articles. He's like, no. You got to zoom out. You got to look at the whole page because it's the ads that tell you what people care about. And I was like, oh my God. So once I zoomed out and went back to the articles, the ads were fascinating and they tell you so much. So people cared about their digestion, sluggish digestion, take this, cure-all. Women wanted thicker, longer, glossier hair. Of course they did. Maybelline was still making makeup. Wrigley's gum was making chewing gum. So some things are just literally the same. I mean, who hasn't had some Wrigley's chewing gum? Who hasn't bought Maybelline mascara? But we no longer take mercury to ingest drops of mercury for, what ails you. So it was fascinating to see, what was advertised, whether it was medicine, fashion, shoes, makeup, how to make a man fall in love with you. It's so interesting.
So did you, the poison that was used, speaking of mercury, or, poisoning ourselves, themselves in the 1920s.
Yes.
Can you tell everyone, it was very specific, this kind of poison, how it was procured, what it did, the amount. Could you just talk a little bit about the murder weapon? I guess it is a weapon.
The murder weapon was chloroform. And the really crazy thing about chloroform is that it was available OTC, over the counter, in pharmacies. And so, first of all, it was used medicinally by doctors and dentists for anesthetically. So to put you under, make you sleepy. You got to get a tooth extracted. Here, inhale some chloroform, but not too much because that'll kill you. But take a few, whiffs and knock yourself out. Then we're going to pull this tooth, or we're going to, do the surgical procedure. And then, just for the heck of it, they also sold it in the local pharmacy in case maybe you were having some trouble sleeping. You could just, try not to kill yourself, but get a good night's sleep. And that is what is really weird and also fascinating about chloroform. Like, you just go there and get it. So she was killed by breathing too much, but she did not breathe it herself. Someone held their hand, a cloth, medical gauze soaked in chloroform over her mouth and nose. And the medical examiner actually testified that in his 12 years of being the medical examiner at Bellevue Hospital, which still exists in New York City, he had never seen a brain so soaked in chloroform. And what that tells us is that she was not only dosed and overdosed, she was overdosed. Like, the person would just really wanted to knock her out or indeed kill her. And whether the person intended to kill her or didn't, they did. So it was a very interesting weapon of choice for all of those reasons. And also because you have to be close to the person. So what that tells us is if you're across the room from someone and you shoot them, that's much less personal than strangling them or chloroforming them or stabbing them, right? That's really in this space. And I think what was really interesting to me is that she fought for her life. And we see that in the position of the body, in the dishevelment of the bed, the sheets around her. She did not go gently into that good night. She fought for her life and she lost. So for someone to hold her down and for 5 long minutes, when someone's struggling, 5 minutes feels like 5 hours when you're in it like that. I mean, I imagine I speak not from my vast experience of chloroforming people.
Glad to
Um,
hear that.
but they held her down and she struggled and they held her and they held that to her mouth for a very, very long 5 minutes. And so I think that tells us a lot about the crime and about the person who committed the crime and what their relationship to violence was like and what their relationship to wanting her dead was.
Yeah, that just reminded me, the apartment in which she died
Hmm.
was so vividly drawn in your book. Did you actually go to that building?
I went to that building. I actually just went to that building a few days ago. I go visit her all the time, as often as I can, just to say hi and, check in. And I let her know, how it's going over here. And that building is now a Hilton hotel. And
Oh,
so I kind of want to stand outside as the people are going into the Hilton and just say, "Are you aware a woman was murdered here 100 years ago? And have a good night's sleep." But
do you know which floor it is? Like, is it still the same building, or was it knocked down and
it
rebuilt?
was knocked down. So at the time, it was a 5-floor, basically like a brownstone. The first floor was the lobby. The second floor was a dress shop. And then the top 3 were apartments, front and back apartments. So there were 6 residential apartments. And she lived in the top back, the alley facing the 5th floor at the back, the rear unit. And so now it's totally different. Now it is a very modern skyscraper, glass fronted Hilton. But you can see there's a brownstone a couple doors down that is what it would have looked like. And I actually have a picture from the tell all by the secretary to the police commissioner, and he had a picture of her building at the time 2 days after she died. And so I knew what the outside looked like, and then I had drawings from various newspapers who had tried to recreate what the scene of the crime looked like. So I had a very specific idea, and I also looked at what apartments like then I knew she had a kitchenette, so it wasn't like a separate kitchen room. I knew it was a 2-room apartment, with a little bathroom. So I had a very good idea and I knew there were windows because the police opened them up to try to get the smell of chloroform out. I had a lot of information about the apartment, but if I had a time machine, I definitely would go back and visit on the night of the crime.
Yeah, I mean, I loved all of the details about the locations. I mean, the apartment, the courtroom, like the courtroom scenes, Francis's home, which was so well rendered.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
and so, we only have 3 minutes left, so I don't want to if other people have questions or if you want to say anything before we're done. But did you go to any other locations that were particularly interesting for you or that stayed with you?
I went everywhere I could. So I went to, Francis's. I went to White Marsh Hall. I went to where Julia lived, on West 69th Street, which has also been torn down, but I went to visit her apartment. I went to down to the criminal courts building, the tombs, they called them. I just went everywhere that I possibly could, walked up and down her street, West 57th Street, because she's 3 doors down from Carnegie Hall Music Hall and across the street from the Calvary Baptist Church. And Carnegie Music Hall and the Calvary Baptist Church are still standing. So those look exactly as they did then, as beautiful historic buildings. And so I was able to see that, those two buildings. And then I'm trying to think where else I went. Just walked around the streets thinking, like, did Julia walk these steps, or did Ella walk these steps? I know the train line that I worked with the MTA, the train museum, the subway museum in Manhattan, to make sure that I was getting the subway stations right, and to make sure I was getting the exits right, and what did the trains look like, and how much did the train cost, and what did the turnstiles look like, and I sent them a list. I worked with ended up becoming friends with her, this wonderful woman, Rebecca, who's coming to my book launch tomorrow. She has a dog mom too, a little dachshund, Keats. And I said, here's where Julia lives and here's where she works. Tell me how she would have gotten to work. Here's where Ella worked. Here's where she, here's where she lived. How did she get to work? And she mapped out every single, every single commute for me so that I could be authentic and real.
Well, it feels authentic and real. And the really great thing is it doesn't feel researched. It feels effortless. So you did it. You made this amazing experience for people. I hope if you have not bought a copy, everybody, please go and order one now. And if you order from Murder by the Book, there are some signed book plates too, right, Sarah? Like,
yes,
the signed book plates. So that's a really good way to order this book is through Murder by the Book.
Yes, so we're going to pop the link up right now so you can order it. They're doing a simultaneous release of both hardcover and paperback. So if you like hardcover and there's a beautiful inside cover, and then it's just, sort of it lasts a little bit longer. If you want hardcover, you can get hardcover. If you just want to keep it light, easier to get to the beach, or the pool or whatever, and it saves you a little bit of cash, you can get paperback. So we're going to pop those links up now so you can go to Murder by the Book, and they have signed book plates. And actually, we did a pre-order campaign where one lucky winner would be entered to win a fabulous gift bag worth $80. They get a $50 gift card, a Murder by the Book mug, a Meet Me at the Bookstore tote, and a Famous Detectives Murder by the Book mug. And I am thrilled to announce that the winner of that is Tracy Smith. So Tracy, you're going to get your swag bag from Murder by the Book. Congratulations. Yay! And here's the link for hardcover. So whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, we're broadcasting live to 7 different destinations tonight. Here's the link for the hardcover. You can also get the paperback, and there's the paperback. And then we have signed, it'll come with a signed book plate and a little message from me. And if they run out of those, just DM me on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or email me at sarah@sarahdivello.com. Very mysterious. And I will send you a signed book plate. And I just want to say Danielle's fabulous book, The Puzzle Master, is also available from Murder by the Book. Hold that baby up. Look at that gorgeous cover. Oh my God, you guys. I know you're probably tired of hearing me say it, but I loved this book. This is my favorite book of the year. And Murder by the Book has it, as well as Everywhere has it. So do yourself a favor and get that delicious book as well, because it's so freaking good.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you. This was such a great discussion. I know so much more about your book. But as I said, I'm envious of everyone who has not read it yet, because it's such a delicious, engrossing experience. So I hope you all enjoy it. And send Sarah a note, right? Like, you want to hear from people, right? I love it when people write to me and say, oh, I just read your book. And if you have more questions, you should totally get in touch with her.
Yes, absolutely. I would love that. I'm super active on social media. So just DM me on the platform of your choice, or you can email me, or you can contact me through the contact form on my website, whatever you like. So I love to talk about, clearly I love to nerd out about research. So hit me up, let me know. And I just want to thank my incredible partner in crime, Danielle Trussoni, New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, Pulitzer Prize Jurist. This woman helps decide who wins the freaking Pulitzer Prize. Amazing. And a books reviewer for the New York Times for 5 years, and so many other incredible things. Follow her. She posts really cool behind the scenes, gorgeous shots of her research and her writing and her beautiful views from San Allende, Mexico. You're not going to want to miss that. So definitely follow this woman, buy her book. Danielle, thank you for being my partner in crime. I'm so thrilled to launch my book.
God, it was so much fun. This was the best conversation I've had in ages. I hope we do it again.
I would love that. And thank you all. There's The Puzzle Master by Danielle. Yay. Thank you all for spending your Mystery Monday with me. I know Mondays can be murder. I hope we made them a little less painful for you. And I will be back next week and on schedule as always.